If you are currently building the first version of your app and you haven't launched yet, then now is the time to start doing outreach for your early access users. That way, as soon as you launch your minimum viable product or your pilot app, the first version of your no-code app, you already have those test users ready to come on board and give you critical feedback to help you start scaling your app. Now, in other videos, we've talked about how to actually do your user outreach and find those users, but that's not what this video is about. We're going to take a step back and instead talk about how to identify the right early access users in the first place, because if you get the wrong users on board the first version of your app, it could ultimately kill your MVP. Make sure you stick around until the end because we also have a workshop that deep dives into the early stages you should be going through with your no-code app, and I want to make sure you get your hands on that. Hey, it's Kristen over at Coaching No Code Apps. We help non-technical entrepreneurs build custom apps so they can start their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses all without coding. And if that's what you're doing, then subscribe to this channel. We publish new videos every single week to help you launch and grow your app. If you bring the wrong user type on board your pilot app or that first version, your MVP, then you are likely not going to get the type of feedback you need to actually grow your app. You'll probably find that inevitably your app ends up kind of fizzling out. And of course, that's not what we want. Now, we have talked about the book Crossing the Chasm on this channel before. It's a really great read with a lot of good information about how to release a technology product. Now, some of the book is not necessarily applicable to what you are specifically doing. And I say that because in our experience, when we're working in the no-code space and with tools like Bubble, for example, you can move a lot differently through the release of your product and through the development of your product, of course. And so what we're going to do is take some of the valuable lessons that are taught in that book, but interpret them a little bit differently so they're more applicable to you so that you can find the right early users and appropriately launch your app. To start out, we're gonna jump over to the iPad here. And this is a model that I have taken from Crossing the Chasm, and it's going to apply to you. We are going to interpret this a little bit differently, but I want to walk through what this model is first so that we can identify the different types of users who you're going to be doing outreach to throughout your launch and the rollout of your app and as you scale. So essentially we have this curve where in the front end we have what are called innovators and we have early adopters. And then we have this space right here called the chasm. And then after that we have our early majority, our late majority, and our laggards. Now, these are the different types of users who you can and will be bringing on board your app over time. The innovators and the early adopters are those early access users who are excited to come on board new tech products, even though maybe all the bugs or the quirks aren't quite worked out yet. And then that early and late majority are the mass market, right? That's the general market that you're going to be going after you go through your initial testing, your beta testing, and then the laggards are the people who don't really like using new tech products or apps if they don't have to, and they're only going to come on board if they do have to. When you look at that curve, you have that chasm, and the chasm comes after the innovators and the early adopters. And the premise of the book is essentially once you can get through the innovators and the early adopters, then if you can cross the chasm into the early majority, that's when things really start to take off with your app, or that's when they can potentially take off. So getting across the chasm is the hardest part. Here's where we're going to kind of separate things out from the book and put our own spin on it. So let me clear up our model here. So what I often see happening is when entrepreneurs are initially launching their app or after they've launched their app and they start doing their user outreach, they target everyone. Okay, so there are no segments of their target market that they initially go after. Instead, it's just anyone who they can contact or anyone who will listen is they're talking to and they're doing outreach to. And that makes sense, right? Because you want to, when you're doing your outreach, you need users. And so you want to go after as many as you possibly can. But in reality, we want to segment out our total addressable market. So if this is our total addressable market, then we want to find the segment that is right to come on board a pilot app or a minimum viable product. A differentiation I want to make, and that is really important to make, is with the innovators. So I actually don't want you targeting the innovators, at least in most cases. And the reason I say that is because the innovators are those visionaries. Those are the people who want to get their hands on the newest and the greatest. And oftentimes it's not as an actual user of the app itself. In fact, those innovators or the visionaries are often investors. And so, in the traditional way to build and launch a tech product without no code, you generally have to get funding because of all the expenses involved. And so, reaching out to those innovators or those visionaries is sometimes the only way to even move through the rest of the total addressable market. Now, since you are building a no-code app and you're using a platform like Bubble, for example, then you can likely skip that step. And I say that because most of the people who we work with are trying to skip that step. They're bootstrapping. And so you don't necessarily need to focus on those innovators or visionaries first. When you're doing your initial launch, that pilot launch, you also don't want to focus on the early majority or the late majority, and especially not the laggards. Those types of users need a more fleshed out product. Now, when you are launching the first version of your app, it should not be perfect. And I'll say this again and again, and I'll keep saying it forever, but if you try to launch a perfect product right off the bat with your very first launch, then you are doing more harm to yourself than you are good. Because what you want to do is identify the smallest, leanest solution to your target market's needs that will solve their problem. And you want to let them help you flesh out and perfect that product. If you do all the fleshing out and perfecting, then you're going to do it based on your own assumptions. And assumptions are just educated guesses, sometimes just guesses altogether. You want actual feedback from users to help you expand your product. Because these user groups or these segments of your total addressable market need a more fleshed out product, then you don't want to target them for your initial launch. Instead, you really want to hone in on these early adopters specifically. By focusing on early adopters, you can get the people on board who are okay not having a finished, robust, perfect product, and you can use their feedback in order to create that finished, robust product. And then you can take it to the rest of your total addressable market. When we look at the innovators, this is often where you are finding that funding that we talked about. But again, since you're using no-code tools, you are likely bootstrapping. And so you're not necessarily going to be spending your time here. And remember, this is our own interpretation specific to our niche where we are leveraging no-code tools. So with the early adopters, the stage you're currently at, if you are currently building your app or you're planning on building your app right now and you haven't executed your first launch, then this is really what you're targeting right now. So this is your pilot launch or your beta launch and or your beta launch. Those are a little bit different. With pilot testing, you are validating your product. With beta testing, you're really aiming for consistency and adoption with that validated product. And so early adopters are perfect for that testing and for getting that feedback that is going to help you flesh out your product and then move across that chasm and into the early majority. Now, this is where we start to look at our general app rollout. So this is more so like your general market release. Okay, so you are moving out of your testing phases. You've gotten the feedback you need to where you know your app is providing value. You are now charging your users and you're executing that general app rollout. Okay, so this is where the early majority is targeted. So you are not necessarily needing to do a ton of convincing like you would be with the laggards, for example, and you're going to have an easier time with the early majority versus the late majority who need a lot of proof from previous use of the product. Okay, so you're going to be doing your general rollout there, and then once you get to the late majority and the laggards, this is when you're really just scaling your app. Now, when I say scale, sometimes it can sound like a destination, and it's not. And so it's important to understand what that stage actually is. And what we mean when we talk about scale is at that point, you have a product that works. You have a product that solves users' needs consistently, effectively. You have outreach channels, user acquisition channels that work, and you have systematized much of your business. So now we're not looking at any early stages with your app. We're looking at later business stages where you are building out your team so that your team can be leveraged instead of your own time. You're building out systems around your business, around your marketing, around your sales, and all of that. Okay, so you're essentially adding a lot of leverage to your business so that you can scale larger. And that's why at that point you're moving into the later stages of your total addressable market. You're adding on more user types, you are potentially expanding your app to more use cases, potentially. But that's kind of what we're talking about when we say scale. So let's hone back in on this, right? When you're working toward your pilot and your beta stages, you are targeting those early adopters. And I want to talk through some traits of those early adopters so that you can identify them when you're doing your initial outreach. Early adopters should be your lowest hanging fruit. Ideally, if you're building an app, you have experience within that industry or that market, and you have existing access points to that market. So maybe you have existing connections through colleagues, coworkers, clients, people in groups that you're in, maybe community groups, right? So when you are going after those early adopters, you really want them to be low-hanging fruit. You want low levels of friction in order to convert them into your pilot and beta testers. So you don't want to have scaled up marketing or fleshed out marketing plans in order to bring them on board. You really want to be able to reach out, have a conversation, convert them into being an early access user. And that's kind of it. Now, with these people, you want to make sure that they are comfortable using software, using different apps, trying out new apps, and you'll know the difference. I mean, you probably know people in your personal life, some who really hate learning new tech and others who really love learning new tech. Well, you want to veer on the side of loving learning new tech versus the other, okay? So you want a comfort with technology. You want an excitement with finding a better solution and trying out new solutions. Sometimes, some people have shiny object syndrome where they find a tool and the tool works for them, but they keep looking for other tools simply because they like doing that. Well, that type of shiny object syndrome can be helpful because they're going to be more eager to try your tool out versus seeing it as more of a task. Now, that being said, you still want to make sure they have the problem that your app is intended to solve and that they need a solution in the first place, because you can have someone who is really excited to use your app, but if they're not actually going to be using it on a consistent basis in real life applications to solve problems they actually need to have solved, then you're not going to get any good feedback from them. On top of that, you want to make sure these early access users or these early adopters are easy to communicate with. You're going to be relying on them to get feedback to help you flesh out your product so that you can step into that early majority segment. And so you want good communicators, people who you don't have to follow up with 10 times just to get a response to an email, because what are the chances that they're actually going to give you feedback you need? So when you consider all those traits, that's going to help you identify those early adopters. Equally as important, you want to make sure you understand what an innovator and what the rest of the segments of your total addressable market would look like so that you can address them at the right time. If you bring innovators on board your app, or those visionaries, and again, this is our own interpretation here, but oftentimes you can be led astray, because if you think about yourself as the visionary for your app, which you are. You currently have a vision of where you want to take your app and your company. And if you find other visionaries who can also picture what a future could look like with your app or with a product like your app, then you may end up getting feedback from them on how to change your app in ways that might not fit your vision. Now, this can be kind of a double-edged sword, because if you find a visionary who has a lot of market insight, then potentially they can help steer you in the right direction with your app. But if you find one who can see the vision, or who has their own vision, but maybe doesn't have the industry expertise or experience that you have, well, they might give you feedback based on their own vision that's not based on experience. And you have to make sure that you keep a scope for your app that is based on experience, because that's validation, right? You have experience coming into this that serves as idea validation. And so you don't want to be led astray by cool ideas or other cool visions. And so you want to make sure that when appropriate, you avoid that type of thing, or at least you understand how to filter it out, okay? Because you really want to keep those blinders on in the early stages, assuming you already have that existing idea validation and experience within the domain. When you look after the chasm to that early majority, these are people who are going to want that more fleshed out product. And if you bring them on board as your test users, then they might get easily frustrated. They might give you more feedback based on experience, whereas you, when you're doing your first launch, you need feedback based on the product itself and how it does or does not solve the intended problem. So not necessarily experience yet, that's very, very soon after, but you have to validate that you can solve the problem first. And so if you get people who are only going to be focusing on experience, it's a little bit later, right? And so you want to make sure that you take a step back and you make sure you're validating the product first. People who are in the late majority are going to be harder to convert. So if you're having conversations with people and they are asking for proof that your product works for X, X, and X situation, and you haven't done your testing yet and you don't have that proof yet, well, you're not going to be able to provide it. Okay, and then with the laggards, there's just going to be so much friction in trying to convert someone like that into being a test user that it's not going to work out for you. So you want to have conversations with your target market, and you don't necessarily want to write off anyone that produces friction in a conversation as one of the later stages of your total addressable market, or maybe being outside of your target market, because obviously your messaging or your conversations can need tweaking as well. But if you know you're identifying people within the right target market, but there is so much friction because they don't want to leave their current tool, or because they are just set in their ways and they just aren't open to doing things any other way, well, then you know you need to address someone who is more open to finding a different solution, not necessarily because they need it, but because there could be a better solution. Okay, let's jump back to the iPad here and zoom in again on this stage right here with your app and with the outreach you're going to be doing. If you are currently working toward your pilot launch, or you are planning out that pilot app or that minimum viable product, then you need to make sure you're building the right features. Because remember, in order to cross this chasm, you have to get product validation, and then you have to make sure that your product can consistently solve your users' problems on an ongoing basis in real life applications. So you have to make sure you're building the right product, and you're not focusing on features that your early majority, late majority, or laggards would want, but on features that are critical in this early adoption stage. And to do that, I want you to head to coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop, where we're going to walk you through a process of identifying exactly what that product should look like so that you can appropriately launch and follow this rollout plan from there. So head to coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop for that. It's a free extended training you can join in on. I'll link it in this description below, and you'll see it on the screen here. Make sure you get your hands on that as you move forward. And hey, if you found this video helpful, if you could give it a like down below, we would really appreciate it. It helps us reach even more people to help them build and launch their apps too. All right, I hope this was helpful for you. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.